They say a traffic stop is nothing special, just part of a day's work for an officer. But not every stop is what it seems. In a world where judgment often comes before understanding, one man's calm composure and another's unchecked authority are about to collide. Officer Rick Dalton thought it was just another late evening, just another driver who looked out of place. But what he didn't know was that the man he was about to interrogate held the very power to evaluate him. The badge Dalton wore with pride would soon be tested. Not by force, not by anger, but by the quiet weight of integrity. This isn't a story about violence. It's a story about perception, power, and the moment a man realizes he's been looking at the world through the wrong lens. What begins as a stoplight violation becomes a reckoning, one that will echo far beyond the roadside. The sun was sinking low over East Haven, casting long, honeyed shadows across rows of modest houses and sleepy storefronts. The late rush hour buzzed faintly in the distance, but this neighborhood, Maple Avenue, was quiet, almost peaceful. Behind the wheel of a graphite gray sedan, Malcolm Gray loosened his tie with one hand and adjusted the air conditioning with the other. It had been one of those days. Meetings, deadlines, expectations stacked like bricks. He exhaled slowly, letting the low murmur of the jazz station soothe his nerves. He wasn't in a hurry. Dinner was waiting at home, maybe a glass of wine, maybe some peace. He had just passed the intersection of 32nd Street when the traffic light ahead shifted to yellow. Out of habit, he eased off the gas and coasted to a smooth stop as it turned red. And then, flashing lights, red and blue, a piercing siren. Malcolm's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror. A police cruiser had materialized behind him. The sudden brightness of the lights washed over his dashboard, bouncing across his windshield like a warning flare. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He didn't need to. He knew the drill. Slowly, deliberately, he turned down the radio, shifted the car into park, and rolled down the window. His heart wasn't racing, but it wasn't steady either. He hadn't done anything wrong, not even close, but that didn't always matter, and he knew it. The door of the patrol car opened with a mechanical clunk, and Officer Rick Dalton stepped out, like a man stepping onto a stage he believed he owned. His every movement was measured, practiced, the kind of presence built over years of having his authority go unquestioned. With a square jaw and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the fading sun, he looked more like a caricature of control than a servant of the law. His hand hovered near his belt as he approached, not quite aggressive, but not exactly relaxed either. Malcolm remained seated, calm, his hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. His window was already lowered, his posture neutral, and his expression unreadable. Dalton didn't greet him. He didn't explain. Just one flat sentence, sharp as gravel. License and registration. There was no attempt at connection, only command. Malcolm gave a single nod, reached slowly into the glove compartment and retrieved the necessary documents with the kind of calm that only comes from experience. He handed them over without a word. Dalton accepted them and stood silently, his gaze scanning the papers far longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to pop out and justify the discomfort he clearly felt. Then came the first question, casual on the surface but soaked in subtext. "You're not from around here, are you?" The pause before Malcolm's answer was barely noticeable. "I moved here a few months ago," he said evenly. "The address is on the license." But Dalton wasn't paying attention to answers. He was hunting for reasons. His eyes didn't flicker. His stance didn't ease. The traffic violation had already faded into the background. Now he wasn't dealing with a driver. He was dealing with a profile. Something about Malcolm's appearance, his skin tone, his composure, his silence, had flipped a switch in the officer's mind. There was no threat, no resistance, no reason to escalate, and yet the air between them had shifted. Malcolm could feel it. He'd felt it before. This was no longer about a stop sign. Dalton stared at Malcolm like he was a puzzle missing its corner pieces. Something didn't sit right, and the officer couldn't name it, which only made the discomfort worse. He kept flipping the ID back and forth in his fingers, not out of necessity but as a kind of stall tactic. He was watching, assessing, trying to force a crack. But Malcolm wasn't cracking. His posture remained steady, his breathing controlled and his gaze unwavering. He didn't project arrogance, but he also didn't yield an inch. And that's what really bothered Dalton. Not defiance, but the refusal to submit to the script he had already written in his head. A well-dressed black man alone in a nice car late in the evening. Dalton didn't need to say it aloud. The weight of that image had already done its work inside his assumptions. "You in sales or something?" Dalton asked suddenly, his tone pretending to be conversational but brimming with condescension. "Guys like you always seem to be selling something." Malcolm's expression didn't change. "I'm not in sales," he replied, calm and concise. Dalton raised an eyebrow, as if that alone were suspicious. "Lawyer?" he added, almost sarcastically. Malcolm let the question hang for a second before answering. "Does it matter?" Dalton smirked faintly, but it lacked conviction. He wasn't used to people like Malcolm not reacting. Most people squirmed, apologized, over-explained, but Malcolm wasn't playing that game. He was answering just enough to stay polite, but not enough to give Dalton more power. "You're a little too calm for my liking," Dalton muttered, stepping slightly closer, trying to reclaim ground that was already slipping away from him. "I've been in this situation before," Malcolm said plainly. "I know how it usually goes, so I stay calm." Dalton studied him for another long second, but it was clear something had shifted. The confidence that usually dripped from his voice now sounded uncertain. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was running the show anymore. He glanced down at the license in his hand, as if it might tell him what kind of man he was really dealing with. But it didn't. It was just a name, just an address. Nothing on that piece of plastic explained the control Malcolm carried in his silence. Dalton wasn't dealing with a criminal. He was dealing with someone who knew his rights. Worse, someone who was used to dealing with men like Dalton. And deep down, that terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Dalton adjusted his stance just slightly, as if trying to regain a grip he didn't realize he was losing. His fingers brushed the top of his duty belt, not drawing attention to the weapon, but reminding both of them that it was there. "I need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, tone clipped, authoritative. It wasn't a request. Malcolm's hands tightened subtly on the steering wheel. Not out of fear, but as a quiet register of the moment. He glanced at Dalton, measured and calm. "Is there a particular reason for that, officer?" Dalton's jaw tensed. "I asked you to step out. Don't make this more complicated." The threat was unspoken but unmistakable. But Malcolm wasn't moved. He exhaled slowly and unbuckled his seatbelt with a quiet click. "All right." His tone remained even, almost disarming. He stepped out slowly, his movements deliberate, non-confrontational. As he rose to his full height, slightly taller than Dalton, something shifted again. Not in volume, but in atmosphere. Malcolm wasn't just complying, he was observing, and Dalton could feel it. "Hands where I can see them," Dalton ordered, stepping to the side. Malcolm raised his palms, fingers open. "Is there something you're specifically looking for?" Malcolm asked, voice still calm, yet edged with clarity. Dalton hesitated for half a second. "Just procedure," he muttered. "We've had incidents lately. Can't be too careful." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, locking eyes. Incidents involving men in suits driving home from work? Or is this about something else? The question was direct, not emotional, not aggressive, just sharp enough to draw blood. And it did. For the first time, Dalton blinked. He didn't answer. His posture faltered, just a beat. And in that beat, the power began to shift. Not with a shout, not with resistance, just with the truth, spoken plainly, and a man who refused to be diminished. Dalton shifted on his feet again, subtle but telling. His confidence, once solid like concrete, now had hairline fractures. He paced slowly, trying to recenter himself, but every movement screamed uncertainty. Malcolm, by contrast, hadn't moved an inch. His stillness was powerful, controlled. It wasn't passive, it was intentional, like a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. Dalton finally broke the silence, trying to claw back control. "You're awfully composed," he said, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite land. "Makes me wonder what you're hiding." Malcolm didn't even blink. "Calm isn't the same as suspicious," he said, "but interesting that you see it that way." Dalton's mouth tightened, as if regretting that he'd spoken first. "It's just unusual. That's all." "You mean it doesn't fit your expectations?" Malcolm replied, his tone even, but razor sharp. "And that's what's bothering you?" Dalton looked away for a split second, just a flicker. But it was enough. Enough to confirm that the assumptions he'd brought into this interaction were being peeled back, one by one. "You keep waiting for me to raise my voice, to get angry, to make it easier for you to justify treating me like a threat," Malcolm continued. "But when I don't, that makes me harder to control." Dalton opened his mouth, but Malcolm held up a hand, not rudely, but with calm precision. "Let me ask you something," Malcolm said, his voice soft but deliberate. "If I were white, in the same car, wearing the same suit, saying the same things, would we even be here right now?" That question landed like a gut punch. Dalton didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitched near his utility belt. His silence screamed louder than words. "I'm not accusing," Malcolm added. "I'm just asking. And maybe that's the part that stings. The fact that even the question makes you uncomfortable." Dalton looked at him, really looked this time. Not at a suspect, not at a threat, but at a man. And for a moment, all the rehearsed authority in Dalton's posture began to slip. Because what Malcolm had said wasn't hostile, it was honest. And that honesty cut deeper than confrontation ever could. Dalton stood stiff, his shoulders no longer squared with confidence, but tight with internal conflict. He'd started this encounter thinking he was in charge, thinking he could size up the man in front of him and control the outcome like he always had. But Malcolm wasn't folding. He wasn't arguing, and worse, he wasn't afraid. Every second of calm silence, every direct but polite response, chipped away at Dalton's facade. He wasn't being disrespected. He was being seen. And that made him uncomfortable in a way he didn't understand. Until, finally, the pressure cracked the surface. Dalton scoffed, half under his breath, but loud enough to land like a slap. "Fairness," he muttered, shaking his head. "People like you are always throwing that word around." Malcolm didn't move. His face didn't flinch. But the silence that followed was sharp and focused. "People like me," he repeated slowly, his tone quiet but loaded. Not a question, not a challenge. An invitation for Dalton to hear himself. Dalton's gaze broke for a split second. He had meant it, but he hadn't meant to say it. Not out loud. Not when it sounded like that. "You know what I meant," he said quickly, defensive, already trying to walk it back. "I didn't mean—" But he didn't finish. "You didn't mean to say it where I could hear it," Malcolm replied, tone still calm but now with something colder underneath. But you meant it. That's the point. Dalton's lips parted as if to speak, but the words never made it out. Malcolm stepped just slightly forward, still non-threatening, still composed, but now the space between them belonged to him. For most of this stop, I gave you the benefit of the doubt. I told myself maybe you were just cautious, maybe having a bad day, maybe reading a situation wrong, but now you've shown me who you are. He let the words hang for a moment, not to accuse, but to declare. Dalton didn't respond. His breathing was louder now, his posture tense. The badge on his chest looked suddenly smaller. Malcolm looked him straight in the eye. You think I don't belong here, that I'm a problem you need to manage, and you're right about one thing. I do talk about fairness, because I've spent a lifetime not receiving it. And today I walked into this moment hoping for it one more time. Dalton's throat moved in a silent swallow, but he still said nothing. And now I know, Malcolm said, voice even, sharp as glass. It's not just a traffic stop. It's a mirror. Dalton stood frozen, the weight of Malcolm's words still hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. He looked down for a moment, as if searching the asphalt for something, an answer, an escape, anything to ground himself. But it didn't come. Malcolm remained quiet for a few beats, then slowly reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. His movements were calm, deliberate. I'm going to reach into my jacket, he said, tone even. No sudden movements, no surprises, just something you should see. Dalton's hand instinctively hovered near his belt, tension rippling through his frame. But he didn't speak. He just watched. Malcolm pulled out a slim black leather wallet and flipped it open with practiced ease. The badge inside gleamed under the fading sunlight. Polished, official, unmistakable. Malcolm Gray, he said simply. Director of Internal Affairs, East Haven Police Department. Dalton's eyes snapped to the badge, then back to Malcolm's face. It was like watching his mind short-circuit in real time. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His posture stiffened, then sagged. Like all the authority had drained from his spine. Internal Affairs, he finally said, but the words came out thin, uncertain. Yes, Malcolm replied, stepping forward, not with threat, but with absolute presence. The same division responsible for overseeing officer conduct, use of force, and internal ethics. He let that linger for just a second, then added, which means I'm here not just as a civilian. I'm the one who evaluates whether people like you should still be wearing that badge. Dalton's face went pale. The air between them had shifted again, but this time permanently. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. This was an evaluation, and he was the one being judged. The hand near his belt dropped away slowly. His mouth opened again, but there was nothing useful left to say. Malcolm closed his badge wallet, slipped it back into his coat, and said quietly, "Now you understand why I stayed calm. It wasn't fear. It was restraint." For the first time since the stop began, Dalton didn't know where to look. His eyes darted from Malcolm's face to the ground, to his own hands, like they no longer belonged to him. The sharp edge in Malcolm's voice hadn't risen, but its weight had only grown heavier. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of realization, and that realization was settling deep into Dalton's bones. Malcolm stepped slightly to the side, giving Dalton physical space but no emotional cover. "I stayed calm, officer. I complied. I showed no threat. And yet, you escalated. Not because of what I did, but because of what you assumed. And those assumptions," he paused, letting the moment breathe, "just might cost you everything you think that badge protects." Dalton swallowed hard. He looked like a man who had just been told he was standing on a trap door and had only now heard the click. "Look, I didn't know. I wasn't trying to—" He trailed off, because the words sounded hollow even to him. "That's the problem," Malcolm said quietly. "You didn't know. You didn't try. You just reacted. And in this job, reaction without reflection is how people get hurt, or worse." Dalton opened his mouth again, maybe to apologize, maybe to defend himself. But Malcolm wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't there for a performance. He was there for the truth. "I'll be filing a report," Malcolm said simply, his tone calm but unshakable. "Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because I believe in accountability, and right now, you're the example the department needs." Dalton didn't argue, couldn't. He just stood there, deflated, exposed, and no longer in command. The sun had nearly disappeared now, the light dimming, shadows stretching across the pavement. And in that fading light, the man in the suit had become the one with power, while the man in uniform stood silently, finally understanding what it meant to be questioned, not as a figure of authority, but as a man. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the half-closed blinds of Malcolm Gray's office. The city outside was already alive with movement, but in here, everything felt still, like the moment before a storm. A slim file lay open on his desk, the name at the top, Officer Rick Dalton. The pages beneath revealed a history that mirrored the encounter from the night before. Excessive stops, vague citizen complaints, behavioral flags buried under layers of departmental indifference, nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just enough smoke to suggest a fire that no one wanted to deal with. Until now. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him, eyes fixed on a summary report. He wasn't angry. He was analytical, focused. Last night had just been the most recent data point in a pattern he was now too familiar with. Dalton wasn't a monster. He was a symptom. There was a knock on the door. Linda, his assistant, stepped in, holding a manila folder. "Morning, Director Gray," she said. "Updates on misconduct reports from last month, and the chief wanted me to remind you about the upcoming department review." Malcolm nodded slowly, accepting the folder. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with the chief for this afternoon? I need to speak with him. Urgently." She paused, catching the tone in his voice. It wasn't sharp, but it was serious. "Absolutely," she replied, and left the room. Malcolm opened the folder and skimmed the pages, but his mind was already 10 steps ahead. Last night wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to a system too comfortable with silence. And Malcolm had no intention of staying quiet anymore. The conference room on the top floor of the East Haven Police Department was quiet, sterile, and full of echoes. Malcolm stood by the window for a moment, overlooking the city that still trusted the badge, at least in theory. He didn't carry a file. He didn't need one. The conversation he was about to have didn't require paper. It required resolve. The door opened. Chief Daniels stepped in, his salt and pepper hair perfectly combed, uniform sharp, presence steady like a man who had seen too much to flinch. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, sitting down. Malcolm nodded, turning away from the window. "Yes, Chief." "It's about Officer Rick Dalton." Daniels let out a slow breath. "I had a feeling. I've already seen your initial report." He paused, leaning forward, folding his hands. "Is this going to be one of those times where you recommend suspension and I quietly sign off?" Malcolm shook his head. "No, sir, not this time." Daniels looked up. "Go on." Malcolm sat down across from him, his voice calm but firm. "Dalton isn't the core problem. He's just the proof. The system that let him operate this long without meaningful oversight. That's the issue. It's not just a matter of disciplining one officer. It's time we talk about departmental reform." Daniels didn't reply immediately. His expression shifted, not surprised but cautious. "We've done training programs before, workshops, bias awareness courses. You know the drill." "I do," Malcolm said. "And I know how easily those things become checkboxes. What I'm proposing is different, structural, ongoing accountability, independent review of field stops, clear escalation protocols, transparent consequences for repeat behavior." Daniels leaned back, arms crossed. "You're going to ruffle feathers." "I'm not here to be liked," Malcolm replied. "I'm here because if we don't fix this now, we'll lose the people who still believe we can." Daniels stared at him, the silence stretching. Then he sighed. "What you're talking about? It's going to shake this place to its core." Malcolm met his eyes. "Then it's about time we shook." The first wave of resistance came quietly. Whispers in the hallway, brief glances exchanged when Malcolm walked past. The usual morning greetings from colleagues became shorter, cooler. Doors that were once open now stayed half-closed. He wasn't surprised. Change never arrives to applause. It arrives to suspicion. By the end of the week, his inbox was flooded. Not with support, but with concerns. Too aggressive. Not the right time. You're making enemies. Some came anonymously, others from people he once thought were allies. Even officers who had praised his integrity before were now warning him to go slower. In a closed-door meeting, one deputy chief leaned forward and said, "Malcolm, we get it. You want better standards. But the department's morale is fragile. What you're doing, it's going to break trust." Malcolm kept his composure. "What kind of trust are we protecting if it's built on silence and denial?" he replied. "Because I'd rather have tension on the surface than rot underneath." The room fell silent. Later that evening, Malcolm sat in his office, the building nearly empty, the city lights flickering beyond the blinds. He read over another memo marked "confidential," this one suggesting that internal affairs had become too active, too political, too visible. It wasn't criticism of his performance, it was fear disguised as concern. He leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, "This is what pushback feels like." But he wasn't rattled. If anything, he felt more grounded, because when you shake the system hard enough, the cracks start talking back. And Malcolm was ready to listen, but he wasn't backing down. The hearing room wasn't large, but it was full of eyes, full of tension, full of things left unsaid. Malcolm entered wearing the same calm composure he always did, but this time, his presence felt different. He wasn't here to make an example. He was the example. At the front sat a 3-person review panel, 1 civilian representative, 1 department official, and 1 external legal advisor. Beside them, Officer Rick Dalton sat with stiff posture, avoiding eye contact. His uniform looked pressed, but his nerves were unraveling at the seams. He hadn't spoken yet. Maybe he didn't need to. The facts would. Malcolm stood, addressed the panel without paper, without notes, just truth. "This isn't just about one stop," he began, voice measured but clear. "It's about the culture that allows officers to rely on instinct over evidence, assumption over observation, fear over fairness." He recounted the incident, not dramatically but precisely, the language, the posture, the escalation. He quoted Dalton word for word. "People like you always talk about fairness." And he let the silence afterward make the point. Dalton shifted in his seat. Malcolm continued, "This is not personal. I'm not here because I felt offended. I'm here because it's not isolated. I've seen the reports. I've seen the patterns. And the longer we treat moments like this as exceptions, the more damage we do to the uniform itself." One of the panel members raised a brow. "Are you recommending termination?" Malcolm paused. The room held its breath. Then he said, "I'm recommending accountability, and not just for Dalton, but for the system that shaped him. Whether that's retraining, reassignment, or removal, that's your call. But make no mistake, doing nothing is a decision, and it sends a message louder than any badge ever could." There were no outbursts, no defense arguments, just a room full of people who had finally been forced to look at what they'd refused to see. As Malcolm returned to his seat, the panel began to whisper, and for the first time since the process began, Dalton looked down. Change didn't come with headlines or applause. It came with silence. Awkward silences in elevators, longer than usual pauses in meetings, and hesitant nods from officers who once barely acknowledged Malcolm. At first, it felt like distance. But slowly, something began to shift. One morning, an officer from Patrol Unit B, someone who had once rolled his eyes in training sessions, knocked on Malcolm's door. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Malcolm looked up, surprised. "Always." The officer stepped in, hat in hand. "I saw the hearing," he said. "And I've been thinking about some of my own stops." He paused, cleared his throat. "I think maybe I've gotten too used to the way things were." Malcolm didn't respond with judgment. He nodded. "That's where change starts." Over the next few weeks, more conversations like that followed. Quiet, sometimes awkward, but genuine. Officers asking questions they used to avoid. Supervisors reviewing body cam footage without being prompted. Even the language in briefings began to change. De-escalation wasn't just a box on a checklist anymore. It was becoming part of the culture. Not everyone welcomed it. Some pushed back. Some stayed silent. But for the first time, they were outnumbered. Malcolm didn't need everyone to agree. He only needed momentum. And now, for the first time since he took the job, he could feel it. It wasn't revolution. It was something more dangerous to the old way. It was evolution. The auditorium wasn't filled with reporters or flashing cameras. It was filled with people. Residents, students, business owners, retired officers. Some came with arms crossed. Others came with quiet hope. All came with questions. Malcolm stood behind a simple podium, no teleprompter, no script. Just a stack of handwritten notes he barely glanced at. What he carried into that room wasn't a speech. It was the weight of responsibility. "I didn't come here tonight to defend a department," he began, voice calm but firm. "I came here because I believe in what it can still become." He didn't dodge the tough questions. He didn't spin the truth. He acknowledged every complaint, every broken trust, every name that had come up in community forums and quiet living room conversations. And for the first time, people didn't hear excuses. They heard ownership. "Trust isn't rebuilt with words," he said. "It's rebuilt with patterns, with systems, with accountability that doesn't blink when it gets uncomfortable." Someone in the crowd stood up, an older woman, voice trembling. "Why should we believe anything's different this time?" Malcolm looked at her, not above her, not through her, but with her. "Because this time, you're not being asked to wait and hope," he said. "You're being asked to hold us accountable while the work happens, not after, not if it fails, but from day one, starting now." There was no applause. Just silence. But it wasn't the silence of doubt. It was the silence of people finally being heard, and for Malcolm, that was louder than any cheer. Weeks passed. Reports were filed. Policies were revised. Officers were reassigned, retrained, and in some cases, removed. Not because of a purge, but because the system, for the first time in a long time, had stopped looking the other way. Malcolm didn't seek headlines. He didn't go on television. He spent most days at his desk, reviewing footage, rewriting protocols, sitting in on interviews, checking in with the very people who used to avoid him in the hallway. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And it was working. On a Friday afternoon, a young rookie officer knocked on his door. She looked nervous, but her voice was steady. "Sir, I just wanted to say, what you're doing, it matters. I joined the force because I wanted to be part of the solution. You're giving us a real one." Malcolm didn't smile for the praise. He nodded quietly. "Then do your part," he said. "One stop, one decision, one day at a time." Later that night, Malcolm drove home in the same sedan, the same streetlights flickering overhead. The difference wasn't in the car or the badge in his coat. It was in the air. Slightly clearer, slightly lighter. A shift you couldn't always see, but you could feel. Because change doesn't end with a hearing, or a headline, or a single speech. Change begins again, every day. At the moment someone chooses to do better. Not every story ends with sirens or handcuffs. Some end with accountability. And some, like this one, don't end at all. Because what Malcolm Gray started wasn't a conclusion. It was a beginning. A reminder that real change doesn't always come with noise, but with quiet courage, consistent action, and people who choose to stand up when it's easier to stay silent. If this story made you think, reflect, or simply feel something, don't let it stop here. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Tell us in the comments, what does accountability mean to you? Subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. Because sometimes one story really can shift the system.